Welcome. Welcome everyone to today's meeting, number 5339. And thank you to the Greeting Line, which was the Enterprise Leadership Conference, a wonderful program that hasn't been able to do their work for a couple of years, but they're sticking with it. If you have guests, would you please bring them up to the microphone and introduce them? I'd ask today, we've got a very important program and we also have lots of guests to make your introductions as brief as you can. And we don't have time for the guests to speak. So if you can just introduce them, I'd appreciate it. Let's start with Karen.
Thanks, President Steve. My guest today is Anna Rudell, Clinical Director at Boca High Acupuncture in Willow Glen. Very importantly, she's here because many years ago, Rotary paid for her to teach English in Indonesia, and she wants to learn about us and pay back her debt.
Welcome, Anna. Welcome. Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather. This is Jay. You've met him already.
Way to go. That's the kind of introduction I was hoping for. Dr. Mon, how are you?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. My guest today is Mr. G.P.S. Thaliwal. He is likely to get green card maybe this month and become a Rotary Club member. So I'm not introducing that much. Come on, Mr. Thaliwal.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Welcome. Thank you for coming.
This is my guest, Jay, my fiance, and my partner in crime to head to Portugal.
Wonderful. Welcome, Jay. Enjoy Portugal.
My guest today is Laura Regal. She is my wonderful sister-in-law, and she's retired CSI from the Santa Clara Police Department and now runs a successful food blog.
Wonderful. Welcome to today's meeting. If everybody could please hush so we can hear everyone, I'd really appreciate it. Hello, Ed.
Because you definitely want to hear me.
Indeed.
President Steve, Ed Korea. I'd like to introduce Wendy Roberts, financial god from Strategic Partners. And she attended the International Women's Event, and this is her first meeting with us.
Welcome to God.
Welcome to God.
Mark.
Hello, President Steve. So I'm happy to have with me my spouse, Carol Reed, who's a professor at San Jose State University, and my neighbors who were here a couple of weeks ago. We're hoping to get them into the club, Karen and Bill Klaas.
Wonderful. Welcome to all. Thanks for coming. Speaking of San Jose State, go ahead, Mike.
Steve, I'm here representing the iHouse Committee and Mike Fulton, who organized visits by iHouse residents. And I'm very happy to introduce Ben Lynch and Boba, who is from Ukraine. And so this will be a special treat for him to hear the speaker today. So thank you very much. Thank you for comping the lunches for these students.
You're welcome, Mike. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for coming. Dave Davis.
President Steve, my guest today is Debbie Sajak, and she's a wonderful colleague of mine at Johansson and Young.
My former office mate.
That's right.
Compliments of Dave Davis. 45.
Good afternoon, President Steve. I'm Rob Rennie. I'm visiting past president from the Los Gatos Morning Rotary. I'm part of the ELC team, so I came to give my support to ELC. I'm also currently the mayor of Los Gatos and a candidate for Assembly District 28.
Welcome, Mr. Mayor. Hey, Mike Damberger, I'm getting a little bit of feedback up here.
President Steve, I'm Julia McCrae Goldsmith, the Dean-elect of Trinity Cathedral, and I'm here with my faithful parishioner, Paul Archambault, who also does much volunteerism around town, but something you all may be familiar with is that he plays our bells, our beautiful carillon downtown.
I love the carillon. Thank you. Welcome. Mr. John Ball.
Hi, President Steve. I am here with my good friends Chaz and Cindy Thomas. Chaz and I shared a tent on Kilimanjaro together, but whatever happened on the mountain stays on the mountain. I'd also like to introduce my wife, Paula, who's been here before.
Hi, Paula. Welcome, everyone. Mick and Jesus, come on up to the stage.
Well, sure. I'll just introduce, this is my guest, Mr. President, Jesus Sosa, who is my father-in-law, a Rotarian in Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico.
Jesus, come on up. Jesus is a former president of Rotary Club, and he's going to just speak for a minute and tell you a little bit about himself. Let's give him a nice welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesus Antonio Sosa. I come from Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico. Sonora is close to the Arizona. I was a president in our club, 07, 08. I stay here because my daughter, Marisol, is married with Mick Greco. She is working at LinkedIn. And I'm very happy to visit you. It's the five time I stay in that club. Our club is with activities very strong. Like we have some activity with Bosch, Arizona, is with classes. If you need more information, I stay here. Thank you.
Welcome, Jesus. We have a couple more guests, and I'm going to walk down here to my buddy Vic Corsilia, who is going to introduce his guests.
Vic Corsilia, I have two guests today. My daughter, Laurel Bondy, and my grandson, Giancarlo Corsilia.
Thank you, Vic. And it's very much a family affair. Tom Bondi's here too, who's lucky to be married to Laurel, the most patient woman in San Jose. And Leslie Corsilia is here too. And you know, I'm sort of an honorary part of the Corsilia clan because I tag along with Taryn. So I don't think anybody else has 3 generations here today. Congratulations, Vic. We have 45 people on Zoom today. Welcome to all of them. And I want to point out to the Zoom people, I have done a lousy job during my time up here of incorporating the Zoom questions into the Q&A. Starting today, we will be doing that more diligently. And John Ball is going to help me with that today. Elizabeth Monley, come on up. Liz is going to talk about the Ukraine relief effort that we've taken on as a club, and her committee has done a stellar job of doing. Liz Monley.
And Terry Chapman from the Disaster Relief Committee. 4 meetings ago, President Steve announced a ring the bell moment, a fun and routine spotlight on members who'd like to exchange $100 for a quick celebratory remark. The first person out of his seat was former President Carl Salas, who rang the bell 10 times with instructions that the full amount be donated to the Disaster Relief Committee and specifically for use in Ukraine. And a movement was started. Dozens of Rotarians stood up and rang the bell as well. The Disaster Relief Committee heard you, and we immediately sent the $11,000 that was raised from that one moment to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, or the UNHCR, also called the UN Refugee Agency. The UNHCR has been working with more than 50 NGO partners, mostly within Poland, where the majority of refugees, over 4 million, have entered the EU. Their work has been to welcome refugees and guide them to shelters, food, transportation, and basic needs after leaving with virtually nothing behind, leaving virtually everything behind. The UNHCR is working with volunteer citizens to make the welcome and transition as smooth as possible. Additional projects will take place throughout Poland over the long term. UNHCR is also rolling out a cash support program worth over $190 million to help tide refugees over in meeting basic needs until they're able to draw from the state. At the following meeting, Art Lund pledged $5,000 and Vic Corsilia pledged $500. Email pledges continued to roll in. I had made contact with the Rotary Club of Warsaw early on, and I received an email from their disaster relief chair, followed by Christoph Bach, and followed by another email from the president, Peter Kaczorowski. Terry Chapman, who has family in Poland, will fill you in on our help to the Warsaw Rotary Club.
I'm proud to tell you that we sent $6,300 from this club over to Warsaw. The Warsaw Rotary Club is the oldest club in Poland. It was formed in 1931, and they have begun this relief effort. They formed a coalition of 12 clubs, one of them being an online Rotary Club. And amongst those 12 Rotary clubs, there's 226 people that are working on this effort. One of the things that they told us is that the money will definitely stay with people who need relief in the Warsaw area as opposed to the greater Poland area. And they anticipate that there's going to be about 2 million of those people coming through. So what they've done is they've, in terms of their relief, they've put it into two different buckets. The first is the first stage, which is necessities. And that includes things like transportation, food, housing, and the basic needs. They've done a ton of work already in this area, and some of the stuff that they've done is they have found housing for some of the refugees that are coming through. So they're paying for transportation to Sweden and for packages for those people once they land there to have a soft landing. They've found temporary local housing for the refugees. They've established some refugee centers and are working with other organizations in the Warsaw area to do that. They've also started working with a local grocery chain. So any food that is close to being expiring, they're able to get that food sent over to the refugee areas for their cafeterias. The second stage is more along the lines of jobs and education and adaptation to the new environment. In that space, they're doing things like, there's a couple of surgeons that came from Ukraine, and they've already gotten them into the system so that they could start working locally. In addition, something that was kind of interesting is they formed a Rotaract Club for the 20 to 30-year-olds that are coming over from Ukraine who are either learning to speak Polish or already know the language. And their hope is that these Rotaracts will also help with the Ukrainian relief effort. So they're kind of and become full Rotarians in time. And I just wanted to underscore how hard this has been and what they've done in such a short period of time. I mean, think about this. Our club is almost twice that size of the 226 people that they pulled together. If we had to respond to this, in which we did when we had flooding in San Jose, money came in. They had to figure out where that money was going to land, how they were going to deal with that money, how they were going to distribute that money. In addition to communications, they've told us that they are going to be communicating with us on a weekly basis on how that money is being sent. So they're setting up a communication network, a logistics hub for items that are coming in that are not monetary, but actual physical items. So they set up a logistic hub for that. And on top of it all, our Rotary International president, President Shekhar Mehta, decided on very short notice to visit the Poland Club, and they've been able to host him and his wife and take him around. And one of the things that came out of that was that, interesting, they were saying that when he dealt with the refugees, when he went to the centers, he was much more of a father figure than the head of a very large international organization. He was very compassionate and empathetic to what was going on. And the other thing that came out of that is they had a press conference, and it was underscored that this is a war effort. This is not a humanitarian crisis. And that was first really verbalized there at this press conference, so they're treating it as such. And I guess I just want to close with, my parents were displaced people after World War II, and they came here to the United States, and because of relief organizations, they had a soft landing. They came here with 3 children, they were in their mid-20s, they didn't speak the language, they didn't have any skills, and they didn't know anyone. And so I'm just letting you know that the money that is put into having these Ukrainian refugees come through is going to be put to good use, and families thrive as a result of it. So thank you.
We have an additional sum of $5,000, which includes a generous donation of $2,500 from Howard Loomis, a $2,500 grant from the Disaster Relief Committee. And we recommend sending a portion to our old friend and past partner, Shelterbox. It's a Rotary-initiated NGO that strives to keep families sheltered together during and after disasters. Shelterbox has opened a channel dedicated to Ukraine relief so we can work through them. They are working within Poland and inside Ukraine, where 6.2 million people are displaced and another 12 million people are thought to be cut off in areas ravaged by the conflict, largely due to destroyed infrastructure. Shelterbox is working on 3 big projects, 2 in Ukraine and 1 in Moldova. They are delivering hundreds of thousands of mattresses to shelters within these countries, along with tools and supplies to help restore to a functional level damaged and destroyed homes within Ukraine. The teams are also delivering into Ukraine medicines and supplies packaged by volunteer citizens and governments in Eastern Europe. The DRC has recommended that 2/3 of whatever funds are raised from this point forward be sent to Shelterbox with the designation that they be used specifically for Ukraine relief, and 1/3 should go to the continued support of our sister Rotary Club in Warsaw, Poland's disaster relief program in Ukraine. And I just want to say, thank you all for your incredible generosity. You are Rotary at its very best. Thank you.
Clarence Stone, you want to come up? Hopefully that inspired all of you, and it just happens that today we're ringing the bell again. So if you didn't get a chance to do it last time, you get to do it again, but Clarence wants to say something before we start.
Thank you, President Steve. On behalf, well, let me back up a little bit. So I have some really good news that I know you all will applaud. After nearly 2 long years, I'm going to be done as your foundation president in 2 months. Yeah, the feelings are mutual. All right, so let me share with you, the foundation board has voted unanimously to divert Ring the Bell funds that are coming today by all of you generous folks to the Ukrainian humanitarian effort through Elizabeth and Terry's wonderful committee, the Disaster Relief Committee. So those of you who want to contribute, today's your day. Thanks.
Bring it on. Anybody who wants to come up to the mic, and then I'll ring the bell. John Ball.
You're not going to ring the bell each time though, right? Or are you?
John,
25.
John already reminded me to ring the bell once for each person. So whether you donate $100 or $100,000, we're going to ring the bell once. Right, John?
25, please.
I'm ringing the bell today, big guy.
25.
25 rings from John Ball. Wow. Thank you, John. Your group.
President Steve, ex-President Clarence. 5 rings for you and your dedication to what you've done for the foundation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jerry. By the way, forgive the bell. We're getting a new one. It's quite lame. We're doing our best.
I'll hold it for you.
President Steve and President Clarence, I would like to honor the presentation you just saw about the work of the Disaster Relief Committee with my own $1,000 contribution.
Thank you, Clarence. Much better. Thanks, Clarence. Hi, Ed.
It's a new month. Another 5 rings, please.
Wow. Thank you, Ed. John Kennett.
Another 1,000.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Wow.
Hey, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Jerry.
Carl.
And 1,000 for me, too.
Thanks, Carl. Any more takers before we wrap it up?
I think we got one more. Here he comes.
Rotarian.
I don't know how the ringing works, but we'll do $500.
Way to go. Thank you. Dan.
$500 in honor of my great-grandfather Isaac Orloff, who immigrated from Molokai in Russia, now in Ukraine.
Thank you, Dan. Sarah Klish.
$500 in honor of my Aunt Nina, who left Belgium as a result of the Nazis and came here and started over. So.
Thanks, sir.
Bert George. Oh, here he comes.
Just 1,000.
Thank you, Bertie.
Thank you.
Clarence has something to say.
I just wanted to say, I'm sure all of you know, both Steve and I have had our bells rung many times.
Thank you, Clarence, and thanks to all of you for the incredible generosity. Really does make all of us proud to be Rotarians and help these poor struggling people. Sal or Brenda, or Sal and Brenda, would you like to come up? Can you make this really brief, Sal? I know you're good at that.
We are going to make it so brief. Thank you. We're just here to tell you about the district conference coming up April 22nd through 24th at the wonderful Blackhawk Museum in San Ramon Marriott. Brenda, do you have anything you want to quickly say about it?
Yeah, I think the district conference is a great way, especially for new Rotarians, to get out there and meet other clubs in our district. I mean, our district has 61 clubs, and it's not just all about us. So it's a great way to get to know them. Yeah, Ed, I see Ed's face over there. Yeah, I know, it's all about us. But it's a great way to get to meet folks. They have a lot of different educational forums, one of which is the ABCs of Rotary, which is really great because it really gives you a sense of how we as a club fit into the greater Rotary International and the kind of things that we do. There's a House of Friendship, which has a lot of information and a lot of boosts and stuff about what other clubs are doing.
And if you ever wanted to take a trip with Rotary on one of our missions, there's information about that. There's a number of great speakers, Dr. Ann Matthews, Brenda Cressy, Jahira Salari, who's Rotary International's vice president, and Vlade Divac, NBA Hall of Famer, is going to be there if you're into basketball. And just, I think we're breaking news here, but the Saturday lunch, a certain president is going to be giving the thought of the day. So it'd be great if we could all be there to support him. More information is available on their website, dc.rotarydistrict5170.org, and there's flyers on your table.
Thank you, Sal and Brenda. Nancy Williams, Nancy, are you here? Nancy, we're going to postpone this. I apologize. Nancy's going to give us a gala recap. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year, and Nancy didn't know I was going to do that to her. So Nancy, I'm sorry. We'll do it next week, assuming you're going to be here. It's my pleasure to introduce my dear friend John Ball, who's going to introduce today's speaker. John Ball.
Before you leave today, stop by and say hi to Dan Orloff. He's got an amazing story. He quickly mentioned his great-grandfather, Isaac, emigrating and escaping what is now Ukraine back in 1905. It's a fantastic story. I would like to introduce Steve, and I'll be brief. For those people that know Steve in his professional life, they know this about him. He was our third U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine under President Clinton from 1998 to 2000. He has served at U.S. embassies in Warsaw, London, and Moscow. He is currently a William Perry Fellow at Stanford, and Stanford is where he got his BA in economics back in 1976. He has over 25 years with the State Department, focused on U.S. relations with former Soviet Union and also in Europe. And finally, Steve has authored a book called The Eagle and the Trident, U.S.-Ukraine Relations in Turbulent Times, copyright 2017. I can't think of anybody that's more qualified not to explain and somehow help us understand the atrocities that are happening over there that we wake up to every day, but at least he's got a unique perspective based on his long career at the State Department that will help set the stage for maybe what led to this. So please welcome my good friend, Steve Pifer.
Well, thank you for the introduction, John. We are now witnessing in Europe the biggest war since World War II ended in 1945. It's a war that has no justification. It's a war that is based on the decision of one man, Vladimir Putin. Now, prior to the conflict, the Russians, the Kremlin, tried to portray this really as a crisis between NATO and Russia. But I think there really is no foundation to that. There really are, I think, three motivations for what Russia is doing in Ukraine today. One is geopolitical. The Kremlin wants to have Ukraine back in Russia's orbit. The Kremlin wants a say over not only Ukrainian foreign policy, but also key parts of Ukrainian domestic policy. And they're concerned because they see Ukraine slipping away, perhaps irretrievably. And I would argue, one, that that's true, but it's also, first and foremost, because of Kremlin policy. Nothing has done more to push Ukraine away from Russia and toward the West than what Russia has done to Ukraine over the past 8 years, beginning with the seizure of Crimea, and then a conflict in Donbass where the Russians were involved, which before this invasion had already killed 14,000 people. A second reason is domestic politics in Russia. For the Kremlin, a Western-oriented, democratic, economically successful Ukraine poses a nightmare, because that's the kind of Ukraine that's going to get the Russians to ask, why can't we have the same political voice that they have in Ukraine? Why can't we have the same democratic rights? And for the Kremlin, job number one is regime survival. They don't want those questions raised. And the third reason is Vladimir Putin, who has a very bizarre and distorted view of Ukraine. You can read it in an essay he wrote last summer. You can read it or in the speech he gave on February 21st. But he basically denies Ukraine the right to exist as a sovereign state. And he describes a history of Ukraine that few real historians would recognize as true. Now, before the invasion, there were efforts to try to engage the Russians in diplomacy. Both the United States and NATO said, look, we're prepared, if you're concerned about security issues, we're prepared to talk about arms control, risk reduction, confidence building measures. We know how to do this. We did this in the 1980s and the 1990s. And this would be a way out. And then those types of measures could have contributed to enhancing security in Europe, including for Russia. But the Russians showed no interest. They had two demands, which were in draft agreements they presented in December, that I'm sure the people, when they wrote them down in Moscow, know these are going nowhere at the West. One demand was that NATO forswear forever any further enlargement. And the second one was that NATO withdraw the relatively small military presence it had on the territory of allies that had joined the alliance after 1997. Those were non-starters, and the Kremlin knew that. I'd also note this is a war of choice. Ukraine posed no threat to Russia. The Russian military in active duty personnel is 4 times the size of Ukraine's. Over the last 15, 20 years, Russia has spent 10 to 20 times as much per year on defense as Ukraine. And Russia has 4,400 nuclear weapons. Ukraine has 0. Back in the early 1990s, Ukraine had on its territory the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, and it chose to give them up. And it did that in large part because in 1994, Russia committed to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, its independence, and committed not to use force against Ukraine, commitments which have all now been shredded. We're now in week 6 of the war, and it's fairly clear that the Russian military is not succeeding in what were obviously its initial gains. Because if you look at the initial Russian assault on Ukraine, out of Crimea, from Belarus in the north, and then from the east, there was an expectation on the Russians that they could take maybe the eastern 2/3 of Ukraine. And the main goal was to get to Kyiv, the capital, and depose the government. They had a rather bizarre operational plan for doing so. The initial assault on Kyiv was with relatively small ground units, and then an airborne unit that was helicoptered in. But it didn't work. And it didn't work because the Ukrainians resisted. And the thing here is, it seems like the Russians did not expect that resistance. Russian prisoners of war said they came in with only 3 days of rations. And the Ukrainians report that in one of the convoys they destroyed, they found dress uniforms that the Ukrainians believed were intended for the victory parade in Kyiv. The Russians clearly did not expect a fight. And what we've seen now is that they've been stymied around Kyiv. So the Russian military is now withdrawn from north of Kyiv back into Belarus. It doesn't look like they're withdrawing back to garrisons, but that they are repositioning and being redeployed for Russian military action in eastern Ukraine. On other fronts, Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, only 20 miles from the Russian border, still remains in Ukrainian hands. And most of the action is now where the Russians have made some progress is in the south. The Russian military has now besieged the city of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov for about 5 weeks. It's been bombed, hit with artillery shells, hit with rockets, and it looks very much like what the Russians did to Grozny 20 years ago. It's probably the most devastated city in Europe since World War II. I would note the irony here is that Mariupol, it's a Ukrainian city, but it's a predominantly Russian-speaking city. 44% of the population are ethnic Russians. And that's just one of, I think, I would describe as a war crime and atrocity. It's the indiscriminate shelling of civilian parts of the city that really make no contribution to any military effort. And of course, we've all seen, I think, over the weekend, as the Ukrainians took back the town of Bucha, just north of Kyiv, the sort of atrocities that were committed by the Russian military there. Sadly, that kind of brutality seems to be a fairly common practice in the Russian military. But about a week and a half ago, the Russian military, the Ministry of Defense, announced that they were going to refocus their efforts on taking the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And I think that's actually an implicit recognition that their initial objective of taking the eastern two-thirds of Ukraine simply is not feasible. So at this point, the Ukraine has actually done quite well militarily, better than a lot of people expected, and certainly better than the Kremlin expected. But the Russians still maintain advantages of numbers and mass, but what they don't have is the determination and the courage and the tenacity the Ukrainians have shown. And so right now, it's a question, not will the Russians win, there's a if they will win, and there's also an advantage to the Ukrainians. Is the Ukrainians don't have to win so much as they have to not lose. And right now, they're doing a very good job of not losing. If you look at this military campaign over the last year, month and a half, what you have seen are some significant miscalculations by the Russians. First of all, the Kremlin did not think the Ukrainians would fight. And that's a pretty amazing miscalculation. If you'd asked any think tank expert in Washington, D.C. on Ukraine, they would have said, yeah, the Ukrainians, they're going to fight, and they're going to fight hard. Now, I think we might have underestimated. I did not think the Ukrainians would be as effective as they had been. But I was in Kyiv on January 30 and 31, and it was very clear that the Ukrainians were going to fight if the Russians invaded. A second miscalculation of the Kremlin was they overestimated the capabilities of the Russian military, which has not been as effective as people thought. My guess is part of this is due to corruption in the Russian defense sector, is that a lot of the money that went to the defense sector probably went to super yachts that are now seized in the Mediterranean and not to more effective military equipment for the Russian army. A third miscalculation by the Kremlin was to underestimate the strength of the Western reaction. So you've seen NATO actually come together. NATO has reinforced eastern flank countries, the Baltic states and Poland. You saw Germany, in literally 1 week, reverse 5 decades of policy towards Russia. The Russians were also caught short by the robust nature of Western sanctions. Personal sanctions, banks excluded from the SWIFT international transfer system. One that was a real surprise for Moscow was the freezing of assets of the Russian central bank. One of the things that I think Putin thought he had as an advantage in any kind of an economic conflict was that the Russian central bank had $630 billion in foreign reserves. However, 60% of those reserves were parked in Western financial institutions, and those have all now been frozen, so that the Russian government has no access to them. And then the bulk of the funds that they have now in Russia are actually gold, and the West is now putting in restrictions that will not allow the Russians to sell that gold on Western markets. The cutoff of high-tech flows, so you're now actually having Russian companies shut down because they can't get the inputs. And one story I'll toss out, I'm not quite sure if it's true, but it came from a Ukrainian source. It said that the factory in Russia that builds tanks has now shut down because it can't get the semiconductors and the chips it needs for the tanks. You've also seen, apart from the sanctions, is an exodus. About 400 Western companies have left Russia now, either suspending or completely withdrawing, in part because they've concluded that business as usual in Russia now has too much reputational risk. And this will do damage. The Russian economy, as you can already see inflation accelerating, it will soon be in double digits. And the projections for the contraction of the Russian economy vary, but the International Financial Institute predicts that the Russian economy will contract by 15% this year. In American terms, that's like the Great Depression back in the 1920s. And I will give the Biden administration, I think, a lot of high marks. They've done a lot of work, a lot of hard work, and a lot of day-to-day work over the last 3.5 months to consult, coordinate, and work with the allies and work with partners to make sure that there would be a strong NATO response and to make sure that there would be a strong response on sanctions. And the last count I've seen is there are now 35 countries around the world providing Ukraine either defensive assistance or military equipment. So this has been, I think, a fairly successful effort thus far. The question becomes, at some point, will there be a successful negotiation? President Zelensky has, I think, for the last 4 weeks, signaled that he's prepared to negotiate and that he's prepared to compromise, because I think he's someone who is truly affected. He's saddened by the fact that every day large numbers of Ukrainians are being killed in this war. Unfortunately, he doesn't yet have a partner in Russia that's prepared to negotiate seriously. So the Russians, if you go back and you look at their 5 initial demands, which are really their demands today, they haven't moved. One is denazification. That was a code word for a change of government in Ukraine, a government which is headed by a Jewish president and has a previous prime minister who is also Jewish. Demilitarization is the second Russian demand. My guess is that after the last 6 weeks, the Ukrainians are not going to be too enthusiastic about that. Third, the Russians have demanded that Ukraine recognize Crimea, which Russia illegally annexed 8 years ago as Russian territory. And what the Ukrainians have obviously said, we will pledge not to try to take Crimea back by force, and we will pledge to resolve that in 15 years' time. And the Russians have basically said, no, you have to recognize it as ours now. On the other question of the 2 independent stateless in eastern Ukraine, the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Russians want those recognized by Ukraine as independent states. And what Zelensky has said is, I need to talk to Putin about that. And then finally, the one question where there seems to be a little bit of movement, but it has some complications, is Zelensky has said, we are prepared to set aside our ambitions to join NATO. We will accept neutrality, non-bloc status. We will not host foreign military bases. We will pledge not to acquire nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction. He said, but we want, if we're going to be neutral, we want security guarantees from the West, from Western countries. And in one form, it suggests what we're looking for is pledges by Western countries that Western countries will come to their aid with Western military force should there be a violation of their neutrality in the future. And I think that's going to be a really tough question for the Ukrainians. It's hard for me to see how Western countries commit now to a potential future war against Russia. And my own view is that the best security for guarantee for Ukraine is not to agree to demilitarize, but to maintain a robust military, and that the West should help them build a kind of military that would make the Russians think they should never try anything like this again. So where does this thing go? I guess I see 2 scenarios. I used to see 3 scenarios. The second scenario was that the Russians might militarily defeat the Ukrainians and take Kyiv, but given the Ukrainian success on the battlefield, I just don't think that's possible now. So 2 scenarios. One is at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, the Kremlin concludes that the costs in terms of the losses they're sustaining, according to the US government, they've lost now more than 10,000 killed in action. That's in 6 weeks what the Soviet Union, 2/3 of what the Soviet Union lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. Loss of material losses, the sanctions, the devastation of the coming devastation of the Russian economy, and that they conclude that these costs are too much, and they look for a way out, and they begin negotiating and trying to find someone to lead this mistake. Unfortunately, at this point in time, there are not many signs that the Russians are prepared to do that. And so I think the more likely scenario that we're now seeing is more of a military stalemate. A phrase I learned 3 weeks ago that they use in the military is called culmination. And they say now that the Russian offensive in Ukraine has culminated. And that's a point where the combination of loss of personnel, loss of equipment, low morale, your offense just runs out of steam. And you really can't sustain that. And the question then becomes, does it settle into this conflict where the 2 sides just keep slugging it out, where the Ukrainians will have the advantage of being on the defensive, and I think the Ukrainians still will have the advantage of being more determined and tenacious against the Russians, but neither side can make a breakthrough. And that could be a conflict that could last weeks more, months more, The chairman of the Joint Chiefs staff has said that he wouldn't be surprised if it goes on for years. So I think the Biden administration has the approach about right, political support for Ukraine, providing weapons to Ukraine, and sharp sanctions on Russia. I think there are two things that the West ought to be looking to do looking forward. One is more sanctions. This morning, the White House announced further sanctions on both Russian individuals, including Putin's daughters, and also on Russian entities. And tomorrow, the European Union will also announce some further sanctions. And then I think the second thing is begin to think about other kinds of arms to provide Ukraine. Up until this point, the premium has been on getting the Ukrainian military things that they can use very quickly, that don't require a lot of training, don't require a lot of maintenance by people other than the Ukrainians themselves. So it's meant Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and those kinds of weapons. But if we're looking at a conflict that could go on for months, perhaps it's time for the West to begin thinking about more sophisticated weapons, even if that requires that we bring some Ukrainian military personnel to the West to train them on more sophisticated weapons. But I think, unfortunately, it's going to have to be that kind of effort, basically, that allows the Ukrainians to beat back the Russians to the point where the Russians conclude they cannot achieve their goals by military force, and then maybe get to some kind of a real negotiation, or ideally just the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. So why don't I stop there, John? I'll be happy to take questions.
John Ball is going to help me by asking some questions that are coming in on Zoom. So we'll start here in the audience, but I want to remind the Red Badgers that you have a ticket to go to the front of the line. So if you do come up and got a red badge, just walk right up to the front. Let's start with Mike Block.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Excellent presentation. You outlined earlier in your remarks the three major miscalculations that you believe Vladimir Putin's made, and I completely agree with them. And my question is, how and why do you think they could have been so far off? And what kind of intelligence is going on, or lack thereof, and can you share any insight into that? Because I find it pretty incredible that his intelligence was so far off.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Let me give you my surmise, because the Kremlin's pretty opaque. But there's a lot of evidence that over the past 15 years, Mr. Putin operates in a very closed inner circle. And if you look at the names in that inner circle, they tend to be people like Patrushev. They tend to be people who really came like Putin out of the security services. So it's a group that has a similar worldview. They think alike. And that closed circle, I think, in the last 2 years has become even more closed because Putin seems to be fairly paranoid about COVID. And you can just see the pictures where he's meeting with his Minister of Defense, who presumably has been vaccinated, and they're sitting 35 feet apart on the table. That's a little bit strange. So I worry about, one, it's a very close circle. They get a very narrow channel of information. And there are people in the Russian government, certainly they have a very competent economist running the central bank. The Minister of Finance knows what his job is, but I'm not sure those people are talking to Putin. So does Putin even have a real understanding just how bad the Russian economy is going to be hit in a couple of months? And I think the last factor is, and this is one, again, I'm not a psychologist, but after watching Putin now for 22 years, I've only met the guy twice, and the last time was 20 years ago, but he seems to be more emotional and angrier than he was before. And my concern is that that anger, that emotion is clouding his ability to make the kinds of judgments that you want to make between costs and benefits.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Boba Zhukov. I'm from Ukraine. And in 2020, Russia gained from gas and oil about the same amount of money as GDP of Ukraine. Yeah. And I have a question. When Western countries will, maybe a question about your opinion.
Yeah.
When Western countries will stop to import Russian gas and oil?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, the United States has done that, but it was fairly, we banned about 4 weeks ago the import of oil from Russia. That was relatively easy for the United States to do because we only got about 3% of our oil from Russia. It's a more difficult problem in Europe where you're talking about countries that are getting 30, 40, or 50% of their oil from Russia. And large amounts of the natural gas. I think there's pretty much a universal recognition in the European Union now that they made a big mistake getting so dependent on Russia for energy. And they've come up with plans and projections as to how they can reduce that, but it's going to take several years. So the question is, are there things they can do in the interim? And one question that a group I've been has discussed on sanctions is, could Europe, for example, impose tariffs on Russian oil, a very high tariff, that would then force the Russians to reduce the price of the oil that they sell to Europe to remain competitive? Because the goal shouldn't be so much reducing the flow of Russian oil to Europe, it should be reducing the flow of money back to Russia. I raised that question in another discussion earlier today, and I'm told that the European Union is trying to think things like that. So I think what the European Union is trying to do is figuring out that while they cannot immediately cut themselves off of oil and gas from Russia, are there ways that they can deny the economic benefits to Russia by reducing the amount of money that gets into Russian hands?
I have one more question. In the second week, US said that they will try to supply Ukraine with planes from Poland and other post-Soviet, Warsaw-backed countries by changing their planes with US planes. I also was supporting my friends from Ukraine who were enlisted with this news to say that, oh, we will receive planes and everything, but I think at third week it just stopped, so Ukraine didn't receive any planes. And do you know why it happened?
This will be the one thing I would say where we, the European Union, the Poles, the Americans, we blew it. We talked about it too much publicly. I think had the airplanes just shown up in Ukraine, it would have been an easier way to do it. And I hope that's a lesson we've learned in the future, that if they're going to provide things that look a little bit more sophisticated, don't talk about it publicly, just do it.
I want to work in a Zoom question. Do you have one quick question?
I just want to say thank you.
Okay, thank you. From the Zoom audience, this has to do with the public relations machine in Russia and how they've turned these sanctions into an attack on Russia. And do you feel like that will be effective?
Yeah. Well, I will say right now, based on polling, and there's actually some fairly good polling in Russia, it does appear that the Kremlin has support both for Putin and it has support for the war in Ukraine. And they have, bear in mind, the Kremlin controls the information space, television networks, the radio, the newspapers. So they have a fairly easy field. My question is, can they sustain that public support as time goes by and people begin to see the economic hit they're going to be taking, including the decline in real standards of living, and as more information comes out about the number of Russian soldiers who are being killed and maimed in Ukraine. And maybe that begins to have some impact and change Russian policy.
Next is Mark. I'd like to mention to all the questioners and also Steve, to you, if everyone could be as brief as possible. Steve, you can see we've got a very long line, a great interest in your speech, and I know lots of questions. So if everyone can try to be really brief, I'd appreciate it. Mark.
So I want to flip the first question. There's been a lot of talk about the errors that Putin made and Russia made. Yeah. But what about the errors that we made? Because we've known about Russian aggression since before 2014, and this has been building. And it seemed like we really didn't believe that Russia would invade. And what lessons should we take from the fact that something happened that we really could not fathom?
I'd make 2 points in response. Point number one is actually, the U.S. intelligence community got this right. I mean, they've been saying since December, the Russians are going to invade and it will be a major invasion. And I was in Kyiv at the end of January. The Ukrainians didn't believe that, but the intelligence community called it exactly. I think that what we should have done in retrospect, there should have been a much harsher Western response in terms of sanctions and assistance, including military assistance to Ukraine back in 2014. I think had there been that harsher response, that might have affected the calculations in the Kremlin and might have prevented the miscalculation that led to this invasion.
My question is really quick. What is the sanction and US and ER is giving to Russia? What kind of punishment or sanction are they giving? Are they giving them more money, or what are they doing?
Yeah, well, sanctions, there are hundreds of Russians now who can't travel to the West and who have any Western assets frozen, and there are groups now looking to find other assets to freeze them. High-tech exports to Russia are banned. A lot of energy exports are banned. There's a whole bunch of Russian banks, including as of today, the largest private bank in Russia, that can't do business with the West. Russian airlines are banned from the West. There's a lot of sanctions so that life for Russians today is a lot different than it was 3 months ago. Life for Russians 3 or 4 months from now is going to be a whole lot more different as well.
Tim, can I work on a Zoom question? Sorry. What does China gain from their support of Russia, and what should Biden do about this?
Yeah, China has basically maintained an awkward silence about this. I'm not sure China actually gains, but I think this is actually going to be a loser for China, because China has not done, I mean, Xi says that Putin is my best friend. You know, China clearly has influence with Russia. Putin was there in February, and I cannot believe that Putin didn't tell Xi that he was going to do something about Ukraine. And then he kindly waited until after the Olympics so he wouldn't rain on the Chinese parade. But the suspicion is that Xi knew about this, and the Chinese are not using their influence. And if China wants to persuade the world that a rising China can be a force for stability and peace, this is an opportunity, and so far they're passing it up. And the more that Russia loses and Putin loses on this, that gets tied to Xi. I don't think that works to his advantage.
Just a little bit more in depth regarding, I guess I would say, appeasement, going back to Barack Obama mocking Mitt Romney at the 2012, when Mitt Romney said that Russia was one of the big bad actors. And even going back to Georgia, when they invaded Georgia, the sanctions were so minor. And this could have been avoided. Also, not allowing NATO or Ukraine into NATO for 15 years. I think that would have drawn a line in the sand. What do you think?
Well, let me take the NATO question. I mean, the question about NATO was, and I can understand it, there was no enthusiasm for putting Ukraine on a membership track. Because remember, if you take Ukraine as a NATO, then you're saying we will go to war for Ukraine. And I think that that's been a lead line while the West has been providing lots of arms and money and support for Ukraine and lots of sanctions on Russia. Pretty much every Western Ukrainian said, we draw the line, we are not prepared to send either American soldiers or NATO soldiers to Ukraine to fight the Russians. And that's kept the Ukrainians out because there was not that readiness to make that kind of commitment.
That said, but they would draw the line for Latvia or Lithuania, which are much smaller countries. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, one that line was drawn back in 2004 when Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia entered the alliance. And also, there was a different Russia in 2004. In 2004, bear in mind, I mean, actually, Putin, for his first several years, was actually trying. In 2002, Putin signed with NATO leaders an agreement on deepening the NATO-Russia relationship, knowing full well that several months later, there would be another NATO summit where they would invite countries, probably including the Baltic states, to join. Putin, again, I think a lot of the change in Putin has not been because of geopolitics, but it's because of that domestic concern. He can't sell the country and regime on economics as he could back in the early 2000s when the Russian economy was growing 5 to 8% per year. He has to have something else now, and he's chosen to basically make the West as a boogeyman.
What role does Belarus play, and also how is this a war when only Russia is attacking the Ukraine and not the reverse?
Yeah, well, Belarus has basically played a role as an ally. The bulk of the Russian forces assaulting Ukraine, or that have now been withdrawn, came out of Belarus and have now withdrawn back to bases in Belarus before they relocate to locations in eastern Ukraine. And I mean, the way the war has been fought mainly on Ukrainian territory is because the Ukrainians are the victim of the attack and they're fighting a defensive battle. They don't really have the resources to really launch an offensive into Russia, although there was this interesting helicopter assault about 5 days ago on an oil refinery, which the Ukrainians will neither confirm or deny was theirs, but I think the helicopters were seen heading back into Ukraine afterwards.
We're enormously grateful for you coming today. Was there a promise in connection with the unification of Germany about the expansion of the West into NATO and the related issues? And if so, what was that promise, and how does that relate to what's going on now?
Historians are going to debate this for decades. I was on the Soviet desk back when the negotiations took place. I wrote the reporting cables for Secretary Baker coming out of Moscow. And at one point he said, yes, not 1 inch of enlargement. but he was talking about deployment of NATO forces into Eastern Germany in the context of German unification. Now, and that made sense when you still had 400,000 Soviet troops there. So I understood that as in terms of just looking at a commitment regarding Germany, but not talking about other countries at a time when Poland, Czechoslovakia, they were still members of the Warsaw Pact. Now, there have been other things that have come out as records have been released that suggest that some things were said to the Russians might have heard as no enlargement of NATO, but I think it's a pretty mixed record. And certainly in any agreements that were signed, there was no commitment by NATO not to enlarge. And in 1997, and Vladimir Putin himself in 2002 signed agreements on NATO-Russia cooperation, not raising complaints about NATO enlargement being somehow inconsistent with promises that had been given 10 years before.
Sir, in your view, what are the implications of declaring Ukraine as a member of the European Union and declaring no-fly zone over Kyiv?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I agree with the decision by NATO not to do a no-fly zone over Ukraine for two reasons. One, it was going to have a minimal impact because most of the people who are getting killed, most of the civilians who are getting killed in Ukraine are not getting killed by the Russian Air Force. They're getting killed by mortar fire and machine gun fire and artillery and short-range unguided rockets. The big risk was, the second point was, to do a no-fly zone, you would have to be prepared, NATO would have to be ready to not only to shoot down Russian planes over Ukraine, but to conduct airstrikes against air defense facilities, surface-to-air missile sites that are Russian forces in Ukraine, in Belarus, and even in Russian proper. At that point, you're in an out-and-out NATO-Russia shooting war. Well, the Ukrainians won it. The Ukrainians say we will be neutral, we will not pursue NATO interests, but we want EU membership. In 2013, Russia had a neutral Ukraine. It was in the Ukraine's law, we will be non-bloc. Russia applied huge pressure on Ukraine because Ukraine wanted to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And when that pressure succeeded in getting the Ukrainian president to back off, that triggered the Maidan revolution because the Ukrainians want to be in the European Union.
It's great that we have one person to point at, Putin. He's the guy in charge, but if one of his inner circle takes him out, doesn't some other hardliner pop up and continue this for the next 2 decades?
Yeah, if Putin steps off the curve and gets run over by a bus tomorrow, the guy who comes in behind him is likely going to look a lot like him. But if he's removed, he's being removed because they have concluded that the cost in terms of dead Russian soldiers, losses of the Russian military, sanctions and such are too much. So at least I think it would stop this horrible conflict that Russia's waging on Ukraine. But yes, in other ways, where you're not going to see a Democrat, coming to the fore if that inner group removes Putin.
One more quick question from Zoom. Sanctions so far have affected about half of the oligarchs. Why not all? I'm not sure where that information comes from.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I think anybody who, well, first of all, the oligarchs who were targeted were those oligarchs who had connections to the Kremlin. But I think now they're actually broadening the group, and I think each day or every time there's a new list of sanctions, more oligarchs come out. The other problem is sometimes it's hard finding their assets. So there's actually now, it was formed a couple of weeks ago, a US-EU multinational task force, which is designed to go and track down money that's hidden, and then to the extent it can be identified by oligarchs, freeze it or seize it. So I think that action is ongoing, and that list of those that are under sanction is going to increase.
I should have asked Steve this earlier, but can you stick around for a little bit if people want to ask more questions after our 1:15 deadline?
Sure.
Thank you so much. Great job.
I'll point out that normally when I'm with people, I feel like I'm the forward or the center, but today I definitely feel like the point guard. Got my power forward over there, John Ball. Steve, in your honor, we're going to make a donation to an organization suggested by our friend Arthur Jew, a member in the back. It's called the Get Real Foundation, doing important work to help these suffering people in Ukraine. Also want to point out that we had a number of donations on Zoom today. Lenore Keeve, $1,000 in honor of Bob Keeve, whom we all love and miss. Karen Fox, $500, and some more that are listed on my phone. Give me a moment here to give them proper attribution. Candy Roney and Fred Begun, 2 rings each. Elaine Sullivan, Linda Gold, and Megan Fluke, 1 ring each. So thanks to all of you who are on Zoom for the generous donations. Next week, our speaker is Brian Avery, speaking on Tuskegee Airmen. Should be another fabulous presentation. I hope you all come. Steve, thank you again for being here today, and thank you all.